Hello, Marmalade. Stick with me to find out how Britain put its empire in a jar. Or how Britain turned marmalade into moral philosophy. Britain has a gift for turning unpleasant things into moral achievements. Cold baths, boarding school, queuing, sitting in a wet coat because it'll dry on you, and marmalade. Yes, I said marmalade. That bitter orange substance that Britain somehow elevated from breakfast spread into evidence of national character. I've never liked marmalade, not as a child, not as an adult. Not even during those strange moments when you think maturity may finally have arrived disguised as orange peel. It hasn't. I don't enjoy spreading bitter orange glue on hot toast and pretending it's one of higher achievements of civilization. And yet apparently marmalade matters. Because recently I saw a newspaper article suggesting some marmalade might have to be renamed. Not abolished, not rationed, not placed on some kind of citrus watch list, renamed. It may now have to be called citrus marmalade, which sounds like a phrase produced when language is taken into a small room and processed by a committee. Citrus marmalade as opposed to what? Diesel marmalade? Marmalade of unspecified emotional origin? But of course this is Britain, so a small relabelling question immediately becomes a question of civilization. Because marmalade isn't really just marmalade, it's breakfast, it's empire, it's class, it's restraint, it's bitterness with paperwork. And somewhere in the background, looking innocent and faintly smug, is Paddington Bear, a small Peruvian agent of citrus normalisation. But this video isn't really about marmalade. It's about why Britain confused bitterness with character. Marmalade doesn't stand alone. It sits in a grim little chapel of British food whose harshness has become a virtue. Kippers, gentleman's relish, marmite, piccalilli, kedgeree, fish paste, and various smoked things, pickled things, brown things, fishy things, all of which seemed less designed to nourish you than to test you. These aren't just foods with strong flavours, they're foods whose difficulty has acquired status. Their hostility is part of the sales pitch. You don't merely eat them, you endure them. Kippers, for example, taste like a dockyard fire in a damp wool coat. Not like breakfast, more like a maritime incident. And people who like kippers talk about them with the kind of stern affection, as if waking up to fish fumes is one of the more serious uses to which a civilization could put a morning. And then there's gentleman's relish, which sounds less like a food and more like a euphemism from a Victorian court report. It's anchovy paste, aggressively salty, spread thinly on toast as if one were not eating fish but preserving the idea that the appetite should never look too pleased with itself. God forbid anyone seem hungry, a discreet smear is enough, but even indulgence must wear a collar. And then there's marmite, black, salty, medicinal, punitive sludge from the bottom of beer vats. It's not so much eaten as defended. Every jar appears to come with an argument attached. People don't talk about marmite the way they talk about peaches. They speak as if they've survived it, as if their affection for this dark industrial extract proves some sort of admirable resistance to vulgar pleasure. Piccalilli, oh my god, piccalilli is another horrendous marvel. It's empire in radioactive yellow. Vinegar, spice, chopped vegetables, and the belief that if something foreign is pickled hard enough, it can become reassuringly British. Kedgeree is even more revealing. Rice, fish, eggs, spice. An Anglo-Indian dish reheated into breakfast common sense. The empire comes home, changes clothes, sits down at the breakfast table, pretending it was born there. And marmalade is the sticky orange front door to all of this. People will, of course, say that marmalade is an acquired taste. That phrase is doing a lot of hard work. An acquired taste is never merely a flavour. It's training. It's social instruction with crumbs. It says your first response is not to be trusted. If you dislike something bitter, salty, sour, smoky, fishy or unnecessarily brown, the problem may not be the thing itself, The problem is probably you. Your palate is immature, your instincts are crude, your appetite is too honest. Learn to like it, learn to admire it, and then call that process growing up. That's the trick. The unpleasantness becomes part of the virtue. You don't enjoy marmalade in spite of the bitterness, you enjoy it, or claim to, because of the bitterness. This isn't culinary, it's ideological. Britain often treats pleasure with suspicion. Sweetness is childish, warmth is soft, comfort is dangerous, ease is vulgar, but bitterness equals restraint. A little difficulty first thing in the morning? Now we're getting somewhere. And this is where class enters the room quietly, wearing tweed and pretending not to be there. The British upper classes often define themselves not by having more pleasure, but by appearing less dependent on it. And that's one of the oldest tricks of class culture. Once you have abundance, real abundance, you no longer need to advertise it through obvious indulgence. You can advertise your superiority through restraint, understatement, difficult pleasures, through a frugality only available to the wealthy. Sweetness becomes loud and common, bitterness becomes adult. It says one's palate has advanced to an appetite with a higher realm of discernment, or less politely, into a culture where self-imposed but mild suffering is mistaken for moral depth. Now, this is often confused with Stoicism, but it isn't quite Stoicism. Stoicism, properly speaking, is a philosophy of inner discipline and composure in the face of suffering. Britain lifted some of the costume, the tight mouth, the firm handshake, the distrust of complaint, the idea that comfort makes you weak. But what emerges is something more performative. A class-coded austerity masquerading as virtue. The moral performance of not needing too much, not wanting too much, not enjoying too visibly. And you can see this logic in public schools. Not because boys were force-fed marmalade at bayonet point, although I can imagine that, but because the whole culture understood discomfort as formation. Food wasn't there primarily to delight, it was there to fortify, to harden, to train, to correct, to discourage softness. Breakfast wasn't comfort, breakfast was a lesson. The body was to be managed. If something tasted faintly grim, that could be taken evidence of its value. If it was enjoyed too easily, one is suspicious. And this is where marmalade becomes useful. Not because it's the cause of any of this. I mean, marmalade didn't invent class repression. It just sits there on the table, glowing orange, like a tiny preserve-based confession. Chapter card, the jar is not innocent. Chapter card, the jar is not innocent. The jar isn't innocent. The jar isn't innocent. A jar. Some peel, a breakfast table, steam coming off toast, domesticity on a teaspoon. It looks harmless. But like many British rituals, it becomes less harmless the moment you look at where it came from. I mean, even the word marmalade isn't really ours. It comes from the Portuguese marmalada, originally a quince preserve from marmelo, meaning quince. So even before the English breakfast table started behaving as if marmalade had been personally handed down by Alfred the Great, it had already travelled linguistically and culturally. It was borrowed, adapted, and then defended as tradition, which is very British. We're exceptionally good at taking something from somewhere else, putting it on a nice shelf, and then acting wounded when anyone points out it had a previous life. But of course it depended on imported materials, Seville oranges, sugar, shipping, trade. Britain took fruit from somewhere, sweetness from somewhere else, and the machinery of empire from everywhere, and then boiled it down into a domestic staple, and behaved as if this was a natural expression of national character. It made foreign bitterness feel homely. This was one of empire's great talents. Not just conquest, not just extraction, but normalisation. Turning distance into routine, making the exotic feel inevitable. Teaching breakfast to forget the shipping lanes. The British Empire wasn't only about ships and regiments, plantations and maps with too much pink on them. It was also about habits, small daily rituals by which distance became ordinary and extraction became invisible. Sugar became ordinary. Tea became ordinary. Citrus became ordinary. Rice, spice, chutneys, pickles and preserves entered domestic life as if they'd all wandered in from the village green, rather than through trade routes, military power, labour extraction and all the less photogenic machinery of empire. Marmalade is empire made spreadable. Kedgeree is empire become cosy. Piccalilli is empire bottled in vinegar. The breakfast table is where conquest becomes condiment. Now this doesn't mean everyone who likes marmalade is secretly trying to restart the Raj in a breakfast nook. Calm down. A piece of toast is still sometimes just a piece of toast, and breakfast is sometimes just breakfast. But habits are where cultures hide their assumptions, and food is one of the best hiding places because it enters the room under the banner of comfort, tradition, family, taste, the things we grew up with. But that's exactly why food matters. It doesn't announce itself as ideology, it just turns up on a plate. Before long, the strange, violent, complicated history of trade and empire has become something your grandmother put on toast. That's not nothing. Chapter card, the afterlife of empire. Chapter card, the afterlife of empire. Then there's the afterlife, because marmalade survives not merely as food, but as a pageant. There are Marmalade Awards, World Marmalade Awards, serious competitions, jars arranged with care, judges, categories, volunteers, the solemn international assessment of orange bitterness. And it's funny, obviously it's funny. A country that once moved fleets, officials and rules across half the planet now stages a preserve competition with the great seriousness and a nice tent. A country that once moved fleets, officials and rules across half the planet now stages preserve competitions with great seriousness and a nice tent. But it's also revealing. Heritage is what empire becomes when the blood is wiped off, when the trade routes are forgotten and someone puts out the scones. That's the present tense sting. Britain hasn't entirely let go of the emotional architecture of empire. Not all of it, not even close. The fantasy of seriousness, reach, distinction, endurance and quiet command still turns up everywhere. Often long after the material basis for that confidence has been quietly sent to the breaker's yard. The rituals remain, the tone remains, the aftertaste remains. And food is one of the places where that aftertaste lingers most stubbornly, because food seems harmless. A jar on a shelf could preserve more than fruit, it can preserve a worldview. Paddington Bear may be Marmalade's greatest act of public relations. On its own, Marmalade is a little too revealing, bitter, imported, faintly punitive. Put it in the paws of a polite little bear, and suddenly the whole thing becomes charming. A sandwich under a hat, a duffel coat, a small, vulnerable creature with excellent manners and a suspiciously intense loyalty to preserves. And Britain relaxes. Because Paddington makes Marmalade innocent. He turns the whole thing into kindness, eccentricity, childhood, nostalgia and national softness, which is quite a trick really. The small bear absorbs the weirdness, launders the symbolism and stands there blinking politely while Empire slips quietly out the back door. But then I never much liked Paddington either, and I realise this makes me sound like a monster. But as camouflage for British sentimentality, he was expertly deployed. Because sentimentality is often how a culture protects itself from analysis. Make something cute enough and it becomes difficult to interrogate. Who wants to be the person cross-examining a bear? But here we are. Someone has to do the dirty work. That, I think, is why marmalade matters more than it should. It's not just a toast topping, it's a sticky orange summary of several British fixations at once. Bitterness as maturity, restraint as virtue, pleasure under suspicion, empire reduced to domestic ritual, and the astonishing national ability to confuse what is slightly unpleasant with what is somehow good for you. Of course, this isn't only about food. You can see the same logic elsewhere in schooling, architecture, leadership, work, emotional life, the British suspicion of warmth, the strange belief that if something is uncomfortable, it must be building character, which is, frankly, a dangerous amount of responsibility to place on a breakfast. There's a line between resilience and dreariness, between discipline and denial, between maturity and joylessness, And Britain's not always brilliant at finding that line. It is often preferred the severe, the muted, the acquired, the endured. And yes, this can produce real strength. It can produce steadiness, decency, courage, the ability to keep going when things are bleak. But it can also produce a national inability to distinguish depth from damp. Not everything grim is profound. Sometimes it's just grim. Marmalade isn't a moral achievement, it's just jam that's been through trauma. So perhaps the relabelling question isn't entirely ridiculous after all. On the surface, yes, it's absurd. Citrus marmalade sounds like a phrase invented by people who've mistaken precision for meaning. But once you start being precise about marmalade, you may end up being precise about Britain. Because that's the thing about small objects. They don't stay small if you look at them properly. A light switch can tell you about design. A tin can can tell you about war, industry and preservation. A calculator can tell you about labour, trust and intelligence. And a jar of marmalade can tell you about empire, class, breakfast, bitterness, Paddington Bear and Britain's long-running philosophical commitment to things being a bit crap. That doesn't mean marmalade needs to be banned or renamed or dragged before a citrus tribunal. It simply means we should stop pretending these things are innocent just because they're familiar. So I don't particularly care whether marmalade is renamed. I don't want it protected, I don't want it abolished. I want it interrogated, preferably under caution. Because the jar is not just a jar, it's a preserve and a residue. A small, bitter, orange archive of a country that took half the world, boiled it down, spread it on toast and called it tradition. And I still don't like marmalade.